Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast with your host, Jerry Rogers.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Business of America. And what we do here is important because we talk to the doers. We talk to the men and the women who are in the arena making a difference. They are engaged in innovation, in politics, in business, in research, in science, mom and pop shops, advocates for reform. This is what we do here. We talk to those who are making a difference in the world. And we are very, very blessed today because we have with us, and I made her wait a little bit off mic, so while they made me so pretty for the podcast. But Candace Carrol from AFP, Americans for Prosperity, South Carolina, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, where in South Carolina are you, may I ask?
So I'm up in the Greenville area.
All right, very good. I have a brother who's in Charleston.
Oh, very nice part of the state. I love it.
And then my family for 30 years since I'm a kid, since high school and college, we go down to South Carolina every year as a family, and it's aunts and uncles and my grandparents and cousins and brothers and sisters. It's a great state. But you're doing some great work in the great state of South Carolina, dealing with healthcare, with hospitals, with competition, access to care, specifically certificate of need reform. And that sounds like one of those wonky DC terms, certificate of need. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your work, about certificate of need of reform, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, first of all, Jerry, thanks so much for having me on today and taking the time to chat with us. I really appreciate it and appreciate everyone tuning in today. So for a certificate of need, as you mentioned, it sounds wonky, but in really layman's terms, this would be, if we think about the hospitality industry, it would be as if a Marriott wanted to build across the street or even in the same general geographic facility as a Hilton. And that Hilton that's already there could say, nope, we've got this area covered when it comes to hotels. We don't need any more going up in Greenville or Charleston, wherever you might be. And so we are going to take you to court over it, hold up your ability to build, because we can, because we have the financial resources to do so. And so we were seeing that a lot in the healthcare industry here in South Carolina, and I know it happens across the country as well, to where existing providers essentially block out new providers from coming into their communities, whether it's to build an ambulatory surgery center, whether it's to come in and really open up a cancer treatment facility, or even when in South Carolina, we're talking about equipment. So the dollar threshold here was $600,000 that triggered the certificate of need process. In medical terms, that's really just like pocket change. So you're talking MRI machines, you're talking X-ray machines, you're talking NICU beds that were all being blocked out by the competition by current providers in that market space from being able to expand access and affordability in healthcare in South Carolina.
I've worked in healthcare policy and the healthcare industry for 25 years. I know you're shocked. How could you be that old, Jerry? I know what you're thinking, Candace, but it's true. I've worked for the pharmaceutical industry. I've worked for think tanks. I've done private consulting in the policy and healthcare policy area. And here's what I know to be true, that access to care is maybe the most important issue. Yes, cost, affordability, but access, because healthcare could be quote unquote free, but if it's not accessible, well, then it's not really healthcare, right? I mean, we know that in Canada, we know that in places in Europe, in the UK, everyone in theory has access to care, but there are long lines. There is denial of care because of costs. And so what baffles me, and it's not just South Carolina, it is in states across the country. I'm the editor at Real Clear Health. This is one of our top issues in terms of healthcare reform. And healthcare reform, by the way, that has a kind of bipartisan approach. You don't have to be a Republican or a Democrat to want greater access to care, want more competition. Talk about the competition aspect of this, and how does, if there are more than one medical providers, how that might help with prices and costs and access and new therapies and families having the health care they need.
Yeah, so Jerry, I don't know about you, but I tend to travel a lot for work, and I imagine you do as well. And so, you're traveling across the state, you get off the interstate to get gas, right? And the price is astronomical because there may be one gas station there. They can set the price, and people are going to pay it because they have to. That's what happens in the medical space as well. If you only have one provider in the space, they can set those prices as to what they want to charge you as the patient to come into their facility because they can, and because you'll pay it because there's no other options. So that really plays a role when you talk about certificate of need and you talk about current providers really boxing out other people from being able to come into those communities, because you have this set price that patients aren't able to get around. And in South Carolina, we have 46 counties across the state, and when we're talking about access to healthcare, 8 of those counties don't have access to an OBGYN because there's one there that was boxing out other people. So when you're talking about maternal mortality rates in South Carolina, which are through the roof, infant mortality rates, which are through the roof in South Carolina, and you don't even provide access to care in those areas, it's a real problem. And the same, with NICU bed facilities, we saw a battle between 2 hospitals in the Charleston area who, mind you, were both approved to increase their NICU bed facility and then decided to sue the other one because they were also approved. And so instead of serving the babies, what you saw were these hospitals just tied up in court and patients truly losing out. So when you're able to get rid of, as South Carolina did last year, our certificate of need program and open up that space for more providers to come into an area that's not going to be tied up in court, patients truly have an opportunity to win and be back in the driver's seat of their own healthcare versus being dependent on what unelected bureaucrats say can come and build or not build in their communities. And Jerry, you talked some about how this doesn't have to be just a Republican issue or just a Democratic issue, and we saw that here in South Carolina. The bill that passed here last year passed with unanimous support out of both chambers. And so our Senate and our House members came together. I talked to a number of Democrats who said that they were in favor of repealing certificate of need because, one, either the hospital that was in their area had already closed, so it's not like the CON program was keeping it open. And then 2, maybe they didn't have any medical providers in their area, but a current provider a couple counties away that was part of this large monopoly system was boxing them out from being able to come to their small rural community. So there was real concern around access to healthcare. So we saw that bipartisanship here, which was really exciting and something that I hope that other states will adopt as they look at this type of legislation.
It's interesting to me because we have issues and problems and such things. However, there are solutions to all of them, but for politics. And again, so in South Carolina, you passed this healthcare reform that's going to impact the healthcare business, but also access to care. It was unanimous bipartisan support. Is South Carolina, therefore, a model for this kind of struggle and debate happening in other states? And even more than that, I mean, we're still debating Obamacare and health savings accounts and Medicare for all versus a public option versus a personal option in healthcare. Is what happened in South Carolina a model for how healthcare reform should go in other states, but also here in Washington, D.C.? What do you think?
1,000%. And I think part of that is that our elected officials were adamant about bringing all of the players to the table to have those conversations early on. And so for 15 years, South Carolina had fought to try to get rid of our certificate of need program. And we saw the momentum really start to build post COVID, which started, as you know, Jerry, to poke holes in the healthcare system and when it came to access to care. And that was one of the first things our governor got rid of during COVID was really relaxing the certificate of need
Yes.
regulations here. So that kind of catapulted this discussion as we came into our legislative session. And you saw leadership, both in the House and the Senate, bring together individuals and organizations like Americans for Prosperity, like our hospital association, like the medical association, bringing the doctors to the rooms, insurance companies were in there as well, medical device providers, and really bringing everyone to the table to have a grown-up discussion, which is missing so much in politics right now, about what we needed to do in South Carolina. And so I hope that as part of that modeling system that you mentioned, the other states will look at that as well and say, let's bring people to the forefront at the beginning and figure out, okay, where is everyone's red line in the sand? What can people live with? What can they not when it comes to putting patients back in the driver's seat of their healthcare and providing greater access to care for them?
It's very interesting. I remember years ago, I'll date myself again. I worked for a member of Congress, and Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House. And he would do seminars for staffers. It was GOP staffers in this case. But he said something that always made sense to me, and I've always kept it in terms of my own ethos in terms of engaging the public policy. He said, if you're at the table, so to speak, the metaphor of a breakfast table or a dinner table, you don't have to get the whole loaf at once. But being at the table is a victory. And then getting a slice or two slices on your issue is a victory. And I liked, he had this idea that on many of these issues, healthcare being one, we could find areas where there is 70, 80% support. And again, this is, I think, one such issue in terms of access to care, being competitive in the marketplace. There's something for Democrats because they care about healthcare access, but also, health deserts. You hear this, there's food deserts, and there's also healthcare deserts. And so that's a big issue for the left. For the right, it's competition. It's price transparency, and these sort of issues. And so again, bringing people in from different political persuasions, knowing where their red line is, like you said, or what piece of the pie or piece of the loaf they need to get. And then we can move forward on a lot of issues in healthcare, but also in the other issues that are impacting us. I mean, again, I don't want to go off on a side note, but there are controversial issues that we deal with: healthcare, immigration, taxes, the role of the state in the bureaucracy. But at the end of the day, I think if we frame these issues like you did and like you're doing in South Carolina, I think we'd see a lot more agreement and compromise and a lot more reform that mom and pops and families and, again, we started the program off, kind of the working class, the doers in our economy, those who are making things and are the pillars of our communities will be better served. Let me ask you this. What were the biggest hurdles? I mean, we're talking, it's all like right now, it's all sunshine and like, look at this, isn't it wonderful? But I'm sure this wasn't all good news and bells and whistles and balloons. I'm sure that there was some difficulties as well. What were some hurdles? What were some difficulties? How did you get around them?
Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, this took 15 years in South Carolina, right? Before we finally had enough momentum. And a lot of that was bringing, as I mentioned, everyone to the table, because you have the Hospitals Association, which seems to be the biggest barrier from my experience, in getting rid of the Certificate of Need program and really understanding that, like, for a lot of them, it's protecting that bottom line or the traditional brick and mortar as we think about like a traditional hospital, right? And so there is definitely a time and place for hospitals as part of the greater healthcare ecosystem. And so being able to have conversations with folks who were part of that and letting them understand that, like, look, we're not at battle with you. What we are in battle for is giving patients access to care. And so I know in a lot of states, some of my colleagues have mentioned this to me, that like that seems to be where the rubber meets the road is with the current providers who had to go through that certificate of need process. And so they want to be able to hold on to that because they had to spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars to go through that, or they were tied up in litigation for years. There was a local hospital here tied up in litigation for 20 plus years who came to the table and said, wait a minute, we just got approved for our certificate of need, and now you're going to get rid of the program and just anybody can join, and we had to go through all of these expenses.
So we had to go through the gauntlet. So now you got to go through the gauntlet as well.
Too. Exactly.
That's like my older kids, Candace. Right. That's like my older kids telling me, Dad, why do I have to do this? When Liam, I have 5 kids. The oldest is 22. My youngest is 9. And I hear from the older kids, that's not fair. We didn't have, we had to do that. But you know what? Sometimes, what's right, what's fair, and what's just, these things change over time.
They do, absolutely. And so now we have seen on the flip side of certificate of need being repealed, where hospital CEOs are coming out and saying, this is great. We love this because now we can just go get new equipment if we need new equipment. And so, or we can move to a different part of the county. We have a hospital that's in an area that's really prone to flooding that wants to move just to a different part of the county. They can do that now, and they don't have to go through the certificate of need process. And something I think too that was built into our bill that may be enticing for other states as they're working on this is, if you're looking to move into a county, build a hospital in a county that doesn't currently have one, you don't have to go through the certificate of need process. And so that became really exciting for a lot of our Democratic friends, a lot of our friends in more rural communities who are talking about this legislation, that they could have someone come in, a hospital, ambulatory surgery center, any kind of doctor's office, and not have to go through this really arduous type process. So, I would encourage folks as they're working on this really to try to bring a lot of members to the table, a lot of different organizations, all the stakeholders, but truly try to understand what is it, how can we get to the heart of like what the true concern is. And that's what it seemed to be, was like, well, we had to go through this. It's not fair. Someone else doesn't have to. But once we got around that piece of it and people understood that we're in favor of what's best for patients, we were able to have a much broader conversation.
Yeah. I mean, and again, I am a dad, so I don't like hearing stories of someone denied care or someone with a condition and there was no facility that could address their condition. But was that part of your story? Were there families, patients who, even though we have good news now and reform has moved forward, was it too late for some? And is that part of kind of the warning sign to other states? Like, don't wait on this, because it's not just dollar and cents. It's not just hospital businesses, bureaucracies. It's also people's lives. And
it 1,000% is people's lives. And what we did as an organization is, in between the legislative sessions where we were working on this, we hosted town halls across the state to really try to hear from patients as to what they were experiencing. And something that I learned is, people adamantly want government out of their healthcare, but they had no clue what certificate of need was, and that it's like 1,000% government in their healthcare every day on a daily basis. And so being able to hear from patients who were trying to get an MRI scheduled and had to wait for years for that to be able to happen, or families like mine, I had to travel out of state to get a diagnosis for one of my kiddos because the wait list here was going to be 2+ years,
Wow.
where you've got folks who are waiting to try to get cancer treatment, but there's not a facility in their area that can open, babies dying because of lack of access to NICU beds. So where we were able to really collect all of these stories and humanize what is happening across the state made a tremendous difference to our lawmakers. We collected signatures across the state, over 16,000 signatures from people who wanted to see this go away. So printed it off, kind of single space, dropped it off with elected officials, about a ream of paper we dropped off with all of them, showing support from across the state of people who were very much in favor of greater access to healthcare. So, if you're working on this issue in your state or you're working on healthcare in general, those stories are so, so powerful and really helping to identify what the root of the problem is and talking about the solution for that in this case was getting rid of certificate of need in South Carolina.
We have on this podcast executives and CEOs of companies and those, again, who are in the arena of the economy. It seems to me that this isn't just a healthcare issue, because if I run a company and we're providing health insurance and access to healthcare to our employees, and it's in our best interest for our employees to make good choices to be compliant in terms of medicines and seeing their doctors. The fact that there are places in this country, in America, where because of a certificate of need, we don't have a robust provider system or competition with hospitals and providers. Again, if I'm running any kind of business, this is a concern for me, because then my employees who I want healthy don't have access to a doctor or don't have access to care, or they have to take 3 days off because they have to travel to get tested or to get therapy. So is that part of this dynamic in terms of the economy? Are there other businesses or industry sectors that you were able to tap into to help push this along?
Yeah, so our small business association, the South Carolina Mom and Pop Alliance, came alongside us in this. One, because they wanted to see greater access to care across the state and providing that access so that they had doctors and people who wanted to go out on their own as part of their small business alliance who couldn't open. But two, thinking about the insurance premiums too, right? If there's just one provider in the area and you are a healthcare insurance provider, again, that incumbent provider can charge whatever they want to, send it up to you to decide whether or not you're going to approve it as an insurance provider. Whereas if there's multiple healthcare opportunities for people in your community, then that premium is going to really decrease. So we had our insurance provider in South Carolina, Blue Cross Blue Shield, that was willing to come alongside us in this fight because it allowed for them to really expand access to healthcare, one, and like what they can provide in areas when it comes to insurance, but two, to drop the price of healthcare significantly for folks
stop.
where they're providing.
So what, prices came down?
Yes. Yes.
Candace, you have some kind of secret sauce going on here in South Carolina. I don't understand why we're not taking your exact well, AFP is doing this, of course. Yeah. Americans for Prosperity has been out front, not just on certificate of need, but also the idea of talking about personal options in healthcare, not just public options. So I say in jest, why the secret sauce? But it does seem to me that a lot of those in the healthcare space, you mentioned there's bio, there's pharma, there's medical device, there are all these, there's insurance, right? There are the provider groups themselves, the doctor groups, the patient advocacy groups. It seems to me that what I would do is do a massive, dig down deep on your success. And I would of course you have to apply local conditions and these sorts of things, but you've written the solution here. And again, I don't mean to be all like, hey, isn't this great? I know it took 15 years and this sort of thing. But again, there's so much frustration in politics today. On all these issues, and Americans are like, what's going on here? Why can't you fix this issue? Why can't you agree on passing a budget? Why can't we deal with bringing more competition, bringing healthcare costs down? But you've addressed this. And I think you should be congratulated. What are you doing to export your success, or have you thought about that?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Americans for Prosperity is working on this across the country, leading into the personal option, the campaign that we talk about at a national level. But we also have a lot of other state chapters that are working on this. So our Georgia, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi are states that kind of come Kentucky top of mind, really looking at some of those southern states that surround South Carolina of like, well, wait a minute, South Carolina got this done and we want to be next because that little neighboring healthy competition is good for a lot of folks. So we're also having conversations with states that aren't contiguous to South Carolina. Think about states like Iowa that recently they expanded universal school choice. Well, in the healthcare space, this is very similar to providing greater access to students as providing greater healthcare to patients. So the messaging is very similar. So for those states that have passed maybe universal school choice, but they haven't yet repealed certificate of need, I would encourage you to lean into the very similar messaging as you're talking with folks in that regard. And then I know too that like similarly, our medical associations, you mentioned medical device manufacturers, all of those folks who are part of the fight here in South Carolina are willing to have conversations with their counterparts in other states. So if you fall into that industry and you know someone here in South Carolina, reach out. We are all willing to have those conversations. We want to see other states really put patients back in the driver's seat. And this is the repeal certificate of need is just one portion of the personal option campaign that Americans for Prosperity is working on. Just today, we've got a telehealth expansion bill that's going through our state Senate. So looking to continue the healthcare success.
We're going to have myriad conversations because you're right. Telehealth has done such great work in bringing healthcare to rural communities. And you mentioned something earlier about how because during COVID, a lot of the bureaucracies were brought down. A lot of the regulations were relaxed. And what we got was we were able to expand telehealth, so more seniors and more rural families would have access to health. We were able to bring. I know the vaccine is controversial, but the fact of the matter is, in 10 months, we brought from the laboratory to the market new therapies and new medicines. Again, right now it takes about 10 years and about $3 billion to do that. And so I do think. We could learn a lot from the pandemic, learn what not to do again, but also learn what worked. And it seems to me expanding, a certificate of need, the issue is one example. Telehealth is another. I know AFP is working on this idea of the personal option in healthcare, and what that is exactly what it means. It means putting the patient in charge of healthcare. It means having greater access to healthcare. It means bringing costs down in healthcare, and we could do these things. My biggest frustration in working in politics and policy is that the answers they're right there, but for some special interest or but for some politician who won't compromise. But you've offered up something very special here in the healthcare space on how to frame this issue, frame healthcare reform, so we can have more victories. So I'll give you the last word. Is there anything that we didn't mention, or I want to have you back to talk about these other issues because I like healthcare policy. I think it's exciting. I think it's an important issue. But anything that we didn't mention that you want to mention?
Well, thank you again, Jerry, for having me on. This has been a tremendous conversation, and I would love to join you again to talk about some of these other issues as well. But I would just, again, if you know of folks in South Carolina who were a part of this, whether it was myself at Americans for Prosperity or folks in some of these medical industries, or maybe a lawmaker in South Carolina, reach out. Again, our delegation is willing to have conversations here. It's something really exciting to see happen in South Carolina, and would love to be part of your success in making it happen in whatever state you might live in.
Don't you have a former governor who's doing something now as well? And
we do.
That's kind of pretty big. So South Carolina is leading the nation in many ways. My goodness, Candace, thank you so much. Congratulations to you and the good work. Keep it up. Congratulations to the Americans for Prosperity and the good work that they're doing. This just shows that we can move past partisan differences and even ideological differences and put forth good policy. So, and good policy, is good business. And so thank you for joining us on this podcast, our small little podcast, The Business of America. Thank you so much.
This has been the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast, hosted by Jerry Rogers. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream